The silence after a Viking raid was a sound in itself. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping village, but a heavy, suffocating stillness, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the low moans of the dying. The clash of shields, the screams of battle, the war horns that had torn the air, these were over. For the men who lay bleeding into the earth they had sworn to defend, the struggle was finished. They had been granted the mercy of a quick death. But for their wives, the true horror was only just beginning. This was the moment the Viking machine shifted gears, from conquest to commerce. What happened next was not random violence born of bloodlust. It was systematic terror, refined over centuries into a machine of domination that stretched from the frozen fjords of Norway to the glittering slave markets of Constantinople. The Vikings had perfected a chilling art. They had turned human suffering into an industry, and women were their most valuable commodity. The aftermath of battle revealed the true nature of this enterprise. While warriors lay where they had fallen, Viking raiders moved through the shattered settlement with the cold, dispassionate efficiency of wolves culling a herd. They did not run amok. They worked. Their voices were not raised in savage cries, but in curt, practiced commands. They separated people like livestock. Men to the left, women to the right. Children, their small worlds shattered, were scattered like grain in the wind. The selection process was methodical, devoid of emotion. It was a triage of human value. Too old? A swift, economical kill. Too sick? The same. Too young to work or breed? A burden to the logistics of the journey? Dead. But the women of fighting age? The wives and daughters of the defeated? They were marked for something infinitely worse than the grave. They were about to become thralls, slaves in a system so brutally efficient, it would consume their identities, their bodies, and their very souls. The process of unpersoning began immediately. Viking officers, men with experience not just in warfare but in the nuances of human trafficking, examined each woman as if she were a piece of merchandise. They checked teeth for age and strength, ran hands over limbs to assess labor capacity, tilted faces to the light to evaluate a beauty that would command a higher price in distant markets. Young mothers were especially prized. Their fertility was proven. Their desperation tethered to the fate of their children was absolute. These examinations were conducted not in private, but in full, brutal view of any surviving family members. Children, trembling with terror, watched as their mothers were poked and prodded like cattle. Husbands who had survived the battle, perhaps wounded and bound, were forced to witness their wives being evaluated for sexual slavery. The psychological warfare was as deliberate and calculated as the physical violence. What made the Viking approach uniquely cruel was its bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't chaotic pillaging. It was organized commerce. Scribes, often slaves themselves with valuable literacy, moved among the raiders, recording every detail on wax tablets or scraps of parchment. Age, origin, skills, estimated value. These ledgers of human misery would later be transcribed, filling the holds of long ships right alongside the silver and the furs. The documentation was obsessive, a hallmark of a sophisticated operation. Mothers were wrenched away from their daughters, their screams echoing into the uncaring landscape. In this new world of terror, the loss of a loved one's hand to hold was as devastating as the bite of the iron collar around your neck. You were utterly, completely alone, a single, replaceable component in a vast and pitiless machine. The women, now chained together at the neck or wrist in a long, miserable column, were forced to march across hostile, unfamiliar terrain towards the coast, where the serpent-proud longships waited. The chains themselves were not crude, improvised bindings. They were works of utilitarian craftsmanship, specifically designed for the transport of human beings. Iron collars, sometimes lined with a thin strip of leather to prevent galling on the most valuable cargo, were connected by lengths of rope or expertly forged metal links. The design was precise. It allowed just enough movement to walk and to prevent the entire column from collapsing if one person fell. But it made escape a physical impossibility. Archaeological evidence from major trading centers like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark reveals the industrial scale of these restraint systems. They were mass-produced for a mass industry. The Viking guards who managed these human caravans were specialists in their own right. They were not mere warriors, they were drovers of people. They knew exactly how much food and water to provide, enough to prevent death and a catastrophic loss of investment, but never enough to foster strength or the will to resist. They were masters of the psychology of despair. using fragile, fleeting hope as a tool of control. A woman who believed that quiet cooperation might earn her an extra crust of bread or a sip of water was far easier to manage than one who had abandoned all hope. The routes they took were not chosen at random. Viking slavers had mapped every viable path from the interior battlefields to the coastal ports, identifying way stations, often remote farmsteads or fortified outposts, where the human cargo could be rested, fed, and secured. These stops were not acts of humanitarian concern. They were maintenance checkpoints, no different from a merchant watering his horses, designed solely to preserve the value of the merchandise. Any woman who tried to escape during this march became a lesson for the others. The punishments were public, theatrical, and designed to terrify. Some were branded with hot irons, a permanent mark of their disobedience. Others were forced to watch as fellow captives who had attempted to flee were tortured to death in creatively brutal ways. The most defiant might be crucified along the roadside, their broken bodies left as a grotesque warning to any who followed. This systematic breakdown of the spirit was reinforced by a policy of deliberate isolation. The captors strategically separated women who spoke the same language, preventing them from organizing, plotting, or even offering each other the simple comfort of a familiar word. Sisters were torn from each other's arms. Mothers were wrenched away from their daughters, their screams echoing into the uncaring landscape. In this new world of terror, the loss of a loved one's hand to hold was as devastating as the bite of the iron collar around your neck. You were utterly, completely alone, a single, replaceable component in a vast and pitiless machine. If the march was a terrestrial hell, the longship was a floating, wooden coffin. The sight of the sleek, serpent-prowed vessels beached on the shore was not a promise of passage, but a sentence. These ships, celebrated in saga and song for their seafaring prowess, were ingeniously adapted with brutal efficiency for a purpose their builders never originally intended: human transport. The captive women were herded from the open terror of the land into the confined horror of the ship. They were crammed into the dark, shallow holds, spaces designed for cargo like wool, timber, or tusks, not human beings. Wooden partitions were hastily erected, creating holding pens where women were packed so tightly they could not lie down, let alone stretch their limbs. Ventilation was minimal, a few gaps in the deck planking that allowed in slivers of light and gusts of salty air, but never enough to dispel the gathering miasma. The stench was a physical presence, a thick, gagging cocktail of human waste, vomit, the tang of sea spray, and the sour odor of pure, undiluted fear. It permeated the very wood of the ship and the clothes and the hair of the women, marking them with the smell of their new status. Seasickness, for those who had never before left solid ground, was constant and debilitating, made infinitely worse by the confined conditions and the meager, rotten diet. The ship's crew were not the romanticized adventurers of legend. They were jailers, specially trained for managing this most delicate and volatile of cargoes. They understood the economics of loss prevention, calculating with cold precision exactly how much suffering they could inflict without rendering their merchandise worthless upon arrival. They were experts in preventing suicides, a constant and rational risk. When desperate women glimpsed the endless, gray expanse of the sea and saw in its depths a quicker, cleaner end than the one awaiting them in the markets. Nets were sometimes strung along the sides, not to save anyone who fell, but to prevent a purposeful leap that would represent a direct loss of capital. Food and water were distributed not according to need, but according to market value. A beautiful young woman, destined for the household of a wealthy jarl, might receive slightly better rations to preserve her complexion. A pregnant woman was fed just enough to protect the unborn child within her, a future slave who represented a long-term investment. The sick, the weak, those who succumbed to dysentery or fever, were different calculations entirely. If they showed no sign of recovery, they were often simply thrown overboard to prevent disease from spreading to the more valuable cargo. Their bodies were casually dumped into the churning wake like spoiled goods, their lives less significant than the risk they posed to the profit margin. The journey across the North Sea or down the river routes of the East could take weeks, and the weather added another layer of exquisite torment. A calm voyage was merely a drawn-out misery of hunger, thirst, and despair. But a storm transformed the ship into a chaotic torture chamber. The vessel would be tossed like a toy, the world reduced to a violent, heaving darkness. Terrified women, chained in place, were thrown against the unyielding wooden walls and into each other. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you. And let's begin our creative audio journey together. For the women trapped below, the storm was a microcosm of their new existence, utterly powerless, at the mercy of forces they could not control, their bodies battered and their spirits broken, all while their captors moved with a practiced indifference above them. The world they had known, the solidity of land, the warmth of a hearth, the embrace of a family receded with every league, becoming a distant, painful dream. The ship was a crucible, designed to burn away the last remnants of their former selves. It stripped them of health, of dignity, and finally, of hope. By the time the coastline of their destination finally appeared on the horizon, many were mere ghosts of the women they had been, hollowed out and prepared for the final, formal act of their transformation from person to property. They had survived the journey, but they had been fundamentally broken by it. They were now perfectly prepared merchandise, ready for the market. The journey's end did not bring freedom, but the final, chilling stage of their commodification. The slave markets of the Viking world were not shadowy, back-alley enterprises. They were legitimate, bustling centers of commerce, regulated by law, taxed by local authorities, and openly blessed by the social order that sustained them. By the time the coastline of their destination finally appeared on the horizon, many were mere ghosts of the women they had been, hollowed out and prepared for the final, formal act of their transformation from person to property. They had survived the journey, but they had been fundamentally broken by it. They were now perfectly prepared merchandise, ready for the market. The journey's end did not bring freedom, but the final, chilling stage of their commodification. The slave markets of the Viking world were not shadowy, back-alley enterprises. They were legitimate, bustling centers of commerce, regulated by law, taxed by local authorities, and openly blessed by the social order that sustained them. In Dublin, the largest slave market in the Western Viking world, the scale was staggering. It occupied prime real estate near the harbor, allowing ships to disgorge their human cargo directly onto the auction blocks. This was not a temporary setup. It was a permanent institution. There were specialized holding pens, examination rooms for closer inspection, and raised wooden platforms, the staller upon which the women would be displayed. The city's prosperity, its fine buildings and bustling trade, was built in no small part on the foundation of human trafficking. As the women were led from the stinking holds of the ships, blinking in the unfamiliar daylight, they entered a world that was terrifying in its normalcy. They knew how to pitch to different segments of the market. For an Irish chieftain looking for a household servant, they would emphasize domestic skills and a docile nature. For a Norse farmer from Iceland, they would highlight strength and a proven capacity for hard labor and childbearing. For the discerning, wealthy buyer, perhaps an Arab trader from a distant caliphate, the auctioneer would focus on exotic beauty, fair skin, and graceful bearing. The examination on the block was a public reenactment of the initial inspection on the battlefield, but now infused with the cold logic of the market. Merchants would mount the platform, testing muscle tone, peering into mouths, demanding demonstrations of skills. Can she weave? Can she cook? They knew how to pitch to different segments of the market. For an Irish chieftain looking for a household servant, they would emphasize domestic skills and a docile nature. For a Norse farmer from Iceland, they would highlight strength and a proven capacity for hard labor and childbearing. For the discerning, wealthy buyer, perhaps an Arab trader from a distant caliphate, the auctioneer would focus on exotic beauty, fair skin, and graceful bearing. The examination on the block was a public reenactment of the initial inspection on the battlefield, but now infused with the cold logic of the market. Merchants would mount the platform, testing muscle tone, peering into mouths, demanding demonstrations of skills. Can she weave? Can she cook? A healer with knowledge of herbal medicine was incredibly valuable in an age of limited medical care. Even expertise in something like cheese-making or brewing could mean the difference between a life of relative comfort as a specialized domestic and one of back-breaking field labor. In this cacophony of commerce, the final bid was a death sentence for the person she once was. The fall of the auctioneer's hammer was more final than any sword stroke. It severed her, irrevocably, from the collective misery of her fellow captives and assigned her to a solitary destiny. She was no longer even a number in a ledger. She was now the property of a master, her body and her future entirely at his disposal. The market was the great sorting house of the Viking slave machine, and as the women were led away by their new owners, they stepped from the impersonal cruelty of the system into the intimate, personal tyranny of their new lives. The message was sent, and it echoed across Europe. Resistance is futile, and for your women, surrender is a fate worse than any death you can imagine on the battlefield. For the most beautiful, the most skilled, or the most nobly born of the captives, the fall of the auctioneer's hammer often led not to the fields, but to the great hall of a Viking lord. This destiny, which might have seemed enviable to an outside observer, a life under a roof, spared from the most grueling labor, was in reality the cruelest of all deceptions. It was a gilded cage where the psychological torment was refined into a daily, intimate art. Forget the romanticized image of noble warriors treating their captives with a rough-hewn honor. The reality inside the chieftain's hall was a system meticulously designed to break a woman's spirit, to systematically erase her identity and rebuild her as an extension of her master's will. The process began the moment she crossed the high seat pillars. A captured woman of status would be stripped of her name, the final tether to her past. She might be renamed something Norse, perhaps Thyri or Astrid, a linguistic leash that reminded her and everyone else of her subjugation. If she was Christian, she was forced to renounce her faith, to spit on the cross, and to make offerings to the Norse gods, to Odin, the god of the aristocrats, or to Freya, the goddess of fertility and cider magic. Refusal was not an option. It meant beatings, starvation, or public humiliation that served as a stark lesson to other thralls in the household. Her original identity was being methodically scraped away. A master's mood, influenced by a bad harvest, a political slight, or the mead flowing too freely, could determine whether she ate that day. A moment's hesitation in obeying a command, a poorly concealed flinch, a tear shed at the wrong moment, any of these could result in a sudden, violent punishment. Her survival depended on an almost preternatural ability to read subtle signals, to anticipate desires before they were spoken, to become a flawless mirror of her owner's needs. The psychological manipulation employed was sophisticated and devastatingly effective. Masters became masters of the carrot and the stick, but in a deliberately unpredictable pattern. They would alternate between bursts of inexplicable cruelty and unexpected kindness. A woman might be beaten for a minor infraction one day, and then given a piece of fine cloth or an extra portion of meat the next. This created a state of emotional dependency and confusion. The recipient of a rare kindness would feel a surge of gratitude, temporarily forgetting that her benefactor was also her tormentor. This cognitive dissonance made organized resistance psychologically impossible and compliance a seemingly rational path. It was a form of emotional alchemy, turning justified hatred into desperate Stockholm Syndrome attachment. Sexual slavery was not a peripheral horror. It was a central, systematic expectation. Women were required to be available whenever their masters desired them, regardless of their own physical pain, emotional distress, or simple exhaustion. Pregnancy offered no reprieve. It merely confirmed their utility as breeding stock. Childbirth in this context was a uniquely torturous event. It meant bringing a new life into the world, only to know that this child, the product of violation, automatically became the property of the very man who had destroyed her own life. She was forced to nurture and love a child she could never truly protect, a living, breathing reminder of her bondage, who would call another woman the master's freeborn wife, mother. This systematic destruction of the maternal bond was one of the machine's most insidious innovations, ensuring that even the deepest, most primal human connections were corrupted and turned into tools of control. The hall, for all its apparent warmth and communal spirit, was a prison whose walls were built not of wood, but of fear, dependency, and the systematic annihilation of self. This targeted degradation was applied with even greater intensity to the wives and daughters of important men, the vanquished commanders, nobles, and regional leaders. Their humiliation was a strategic weapon, designed to break not just the individual, but the entire community that had looked to them for leadership. This systematic destruction of the maternal bond was one of the machine's most insidious innovations, ensuring that even the deepest, most primal human connections were corrupted and turned into tools of control. The hall, for all its apparent warmth and communal spirit, was a prison whose walls were built not of wood, but of fear, dependency, and the systematic annihilation of self. This targeted degradation was applied with even greater intensity to the wives and daughters of important men, the vanquished commanders, nobles, and regional leaders. Their humiliation was a strategic weapon, designed to break not just the individual, but the entire community that had looked to them for leadership. When a noblewoman was paraded naked through a Viking camp, forced to serve ale to the common warriors who had slaughtered her huskarls, The message was unequivocal. No status, no privilege, no piety can protect you from our power. Your world is gone. These high-profile captives underwent a special processing regimen. Their noble origins made them more valuable as prestige objects, but also more dangerous, for they were accustomed to command and respect. Viking slavers developed specific techniques for breaking these aristocratic women. The degradation began with brutal immediacy. She was stripped of her fine, embroidered gowns and her gold-inlaid jewelry, the very symbols of her lineage and power. These were added to her captor's hoard. In their place, she was given a rough, undyed woolen surcoat, the garment of a common thrall. Her hair, often long and carefully styled as a mark of her status, was sheared into a practical, slave-like crop. She was then forced to perform the most menial and demeaning tasks, scrubbing the grime from the halls, floorboards, emptying the reeking waste buckets, serving food to men she would have once commanded her own guards to cut down. But the psychological torment cut far deeper than these physical indignities. These women were often educated, literate, and politically astute. They understood the broader implications of their captivity in a way a commoner might not. They knew their suffering would demoralize their remaining family members, weaken their community's resolve, and serve as a potent propaganda tool for their enemies. This knowledge amplified their agony exponentially. Some were forced to write letters to their husbands or fathers, describing their new circumstances in detail and urging immediate surrender to prevent further bloodshed and humiliation. These coerced communications, often dictated by their captors, were powerful weapons, spreading terror more effectively than any army. The most sadistic masters delighted in forcing these noble women to participate actively in their own degradation. They were made to publicly auction off their own remaining personal possessions, to renounce their titles and ancestral claims before an audience of leering warriors, and even to declare their gratitude for their rescue from their previous privileged lives. These grotesque performances were recorded in song and story, shared as entertainment in other Viking halls, cementing the legend of the conqueror and the utter subjugation of the conquered. In this world, a high-born woman's tears were not a sign of weakness in the enemy, but a trophy of victory, proof that the Viking machine could grind down even the hardest and most refined of souls into compliant, broken property. The brutality inflicted upon enslaved women was not the result of lawless anarchy. It was, chillingly, the product of a sophisticated legal order. Viking law codified this cruelty, transforming raw violence into a sanctioned, institutionalized system. The earliest Scandinavian legal texts, such as the Norse Gragas or the later Icelandic laws, treated enslaved individuals, the thrall, not as persons but as property, legally equivalent to livestock, weapons, or parcels of land. A master's rights over his human chattel were near absolute. He could beat, sell, maim, or even kill his thrall without facing legal consequence from the assembly. The system was not a grim aberration in Viking society. It was a foundational pillar of its economy and social structure, the invisible framework upon which the halls of powerful jarls were built. The laws were not vague customs. They were detailed, specific, and comprehensive. They meticulously outlined the rights of masters over their human property, established clear legal procedures for slave trading to ensure transparent ownership, and even set standards for the treatment of different categories of bondage, though these were designed to protect the master's investment, not the slave's humanity. Property rights in human beings were absolute and transferable. The system was not a grim aberration in Viking society. It was a foundational pillar of its economy and social structure, the invisible framework upon which the halls of powerful jarls were built. The laws were not vague customs. They were detailed, specific, and comprehensive. They meticulously outlined the rights of masters over their human property, established clear legal procedures for slave trading to ensure transparent ownership, and even set standards for the treatment of different categories of bondage, though these were designed to protect the master's investment, not the slave's humanity. Property rights in human beings were absolute and transferable. A master could lend his slaves to others as a form of payment or favor, use them as collateral for loans, or bequeath them to his heirs in his will, just as he would a prized sword or a fertile field. Women, in particular, were traded like breeding livestock. The children born to an enslaved mother automatically became the property of whoever owned her at the time of their birth, a legal principle known as ventrum sequitur, ensuring the master's capital reproduced itself. The legal system even established commercial quality standards for the slave trade, creating a bizarre form of consumer protection for the buyer. The brutality inflicted upon enslaved women was not the result of lawless anarchy. It was, chillingly, the product of a sophisticated legal order. Viking law codified this cruelty, transforming raw violence into a sanctioned, institutionalized system. The earliest Scandinavian legal texts, such as the Norse Gragas or the later Icelandic laws, treated enslaved individuals, the thrall, not as persons but as property, legally equivalent to livestock, weapons, or parcels of land. A master's rights over his human chattel were near absolute. He could beat, sell, maim, or even kill his thrall without facing legal consequence from the assembly. Your neighbor was not a potential ally for a desperate woman fleeing through the woods. He was a potential jailer, incentivized by law to see her not as a human being in distress, but as lost property to be returned for a reward. This web of legal and social pressure made the world outside the master's hall as hostile and impenetrable a prison as the hall itself. The cold, hard evidence of this industry is etched into the very soil of the Viking world, speaking a silent, damning truth that corroborates the written records. Archaeological excavations at major trading centers like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark have unearthed the physical infrastructure of human commerce. The most visceral finds are the iron shackles. These are not the crude one-off restraints of a sporadic raider. They are masterworks of utilitarian design, manufactured in quantity for a mass market. They consist of iron collars fitted with functional locks, connected by chains of precise lengths. Some, intended for high-value cargo, even include rudimentary leather padding to prevent galling and preserve the merchandise's skin. Others, designed for the more rebellious or lower-value captives, feature spikes or sharpened edges that would bite into the flesh with every movement, making escape attempts an exercise in self-mutilation. The variety in design shows an industry that had adapted to different transportation needs and control requirements, a chilling testament to its maturity. These are not the crude, one-off restraints of a sporadic raider. They are masterworks of utilitarian design, manufactured in quantity for a mass market. They consist of iron collars fitted with functional locks, connected by chains of precise lengths. Some, intended for high-value cargo, even include rudimentary leather padding to prevent galling and preserve the merchandise's skin. Others, designed for the more rebellious or lower-value captives, feature spikes or sharpened edges that would bite into the flesh with every movement, making escape attempts an exercise in self-mutilation. The variety in design shows an industry that had adapted to different transportation needs and control requirements, a chilling testament to its maturity. The entire waterfront was engineered to process human beings with the same logistical precision as barrels of whale oil or bales of furs. Perhaps the most poignant testimony comes not from artifacts, but from bones. Skeletal analysis from Viking-age graves identified as those of thralls, often interred on the peripheries of communities or in distinct, Spartan burial plots, reveals a consistent, brutal story. These bones show the unmistakable signs of a life defined by hardship, evidence of chronic malnutrition visible in dental, enamel, and bone density, repetitive stress injuries from a lifetime of unceasing labor, and untreated traumatic fractures that had healed poorly, leaving the individual crippled and in chronic pain. The mortality rate among enslaved people, judging from the age at death data, was significantly higher than among the free population. Their lives were, quite literally, shorter and more painful. The grave goods, or more accurately, the lack thereof, provide a final, silent commentary on their status. While free Vikings were buried with their weapons, tools, jewelry, and personal possessions for the afterlife, slaves were typically interred with nothing, or with only the most basic necessities, a stark reflection of their perceived lack of social and spiritual value in death as in life. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. Some burials show even more sinister evidence. Slaves who were killed, seemingly as sacrifices, to accompany their masters into the afterlife. A final, ultimate assertion of ownership that extended beyond the grave. This archaeological record, composed of rusted iron, altered landscapes, and scarred bones, forms an undeniable archive. It tells us that the Viking slave trade was not a dark rumor in medieval chronicles. It was a physical, tangible, and vast enterprise that left its mark on the land and on the bodies of the countless human beings who were fed into its relentless gears. The scale of the Viking slave machine was not merely substantial, it was civilization-altering. Historical sources and modern demographic studies suggest that at the height of the Viking Age, enslaved individuals may have constituted up to a quarter, or even more, of the population in some Scandinavian regions. These were not small numbers. They represented a massive demographic shift, a forced migration that hollowed out communities across Europe and repopulated the Norse world with a vast, subjugated underclass. Contemporary chroniclers, often monks writing in terror-stricken monasteries, recorded these operations with a sense of apocalyptic dread. The raid on Seville in 844 CE netted thousands of captives. Yet these survivors, sold for prices that could range from a few pieces of silver for an older laborer to a fortune for a beautiful, skilled, or noble-born woman, made the entire bloody expedition enormously profitable. The wealth generated was the engine of the Viking Age. It was slave-trading silver that funded the construction of more magnificent halls and even more warships. It financed further expansion, from the settlements in Iceland and Greenland to the river routes of Rus. It established the social hierarchies, allowing a successful chieftain to distinguish himself not just by his prowess in battle, but by the number of thralls who worked his lands and served in his hall. The entire Norse economic miracle was, in no small part, built on a foundation of systematically organized human suffering. The demographic impact on the raided regions was devastating and permanent. Population studies, analyzing grave sites in areas like Ireland, Scotland, and Anglo-Saxon England that were repeatedly targeted, reveal a chilling anomaly: significant gender imbalances. Young women, the prime targets for the slave raiders, simply disappear from the archaeological record. They are not buried in their ancestral plots because they were not there to die. They were ripped from the fabric of their communities, leaving behind settlements struggling to maintain their social structures and, crucially, their reproductive capacity. A village that loses its young women loses its future. Marriage patterns were disrupted for a generation. Birth rates inevitably declined. The social and cultural fabric of entire regions was permanently frayed by the systematic, targeted removal of its female population. This was more than just pillage. It was a form of social and biological warfare that crippled communities for decades, making them even more vulnerable to subsequent raids. The terror this created was a weapon in itself, and the Vikings wielded it with psychological precision. The psychological warfare began at the moment of capture and continued long after the longships had vanished over the horizon. The Vikings understood that terror was cumulative. Each successful raid created stories that traveled faster than the ships themselves, carried by a handful of escaped victims or witnessed by traders. Communities across Europe learned to recognize the signs: the unusual movement of ships, the sudden silence of coastal watchers, the distant, chilling echo of war horns. But this foreknowledge often did little more than heighten the dread. The reputation for cruelty, and specifically for the fates that awaited women, became a weapon that could win battles without a sword being drawn. Many settlements, upon spotting the dreaded dragon-prowed ships, chose to surrender without a fight, hoping that cooperation and the offering of tribute might result in more lenient treatment for their women. Sometimes this strategy worked, often it did not. The unpredictability was part of the strategy. It kept entire coastlines living in a state of perpetual anxiety. The psychological pressure was often more effective than any military threat. Raiders would sometimes force husbands to choose which family members would be taken, imposing an impossible moral burden that shattered families and communities from the inside out. Fathers were made to decide between daughters. Mothers, their own fates sealed, were forced to select which children would accompany them into bondage and which would be left behind or killed. These were choices designed to break the human spirit, to impose a guilt and a trauma that would cripple a community's will to resist long after the raiders had departed. Community leaders, priests, and surviving nobles were often forced to watch the processing and degradation of their female relatives, a deliberate demonstration that their power, their faith, and their status were utterly meaningless in the face of Viking power. The message was clear: resistance brings consequences that will haunt you for generations. Your women will pay the price. Their screams will carry further than any war horn. This terror was then institutionalized through a systematic assault on the soul, forced religious conversion. These were choices designed to break the human spirit, to impose a guilt and a trauma that would cripple a community's will to resist long after the raiders had departed. Community leaders, priests, and surviving nobles were often forced to watch the processing and degradation of their female relatives, a deliberate demonstration that their power, their faith, and their status were utterly meaningless in the face of Viking power. The message was clear. Resistance brings consequences that will haunt you for generations. Your women will pay the price. Their screams will carry further than any war horn. This terror was then institutionalized through a systematic assault on the soul, forced religious conversion. This conversion served multiple coldly practical purposes for the captors. It isolated the women from potential rescue by Christian communities. It eliminated a primary source of psychological comfort and resistance, and it demonstrated the master's absolute power over every aspect of their existence, body, mind, and now, soul. The symbolism was relentlessly reinforced in daily life. Christian women were forced to wear the hammer of Thor instead of the cross. They were made to eat horse meat, a practice forbidden by the church but sacred in Norse pagan rituals. They were compelled to participate in festivals that celebrated Viking victories over Christian lands and the desecration of their own churches. Every meal, every piece of jewelry, every seasonal celebration became a reminder of their spiritual captivity, a continuous erasure of the person they had once been. This systematic destruction of identity was the final, and in many ways most profound, victory of the Viking machine. It sought to prove that a human being could be completely unmade and remade as property. Beyond the immediate physical and psychological torment lay the most coldly calculated aspect of the Viking slave system: the management of human reproduction. Enslaved women were not just laborers or status symbols. They were breeding stock, and their wombs were treated as a primary means of production. Viking masters, with the clinical detachment of livestock farmers, tracked the fertility cycles of their female thralls. Pregnancy was not a private family matter but an economic event, meticulously recorded in the same ledgers that tracked the birth of calves and the yield of barley. Masters calculated the economic value of each pregnancy, making decisions about nutrition, workload, and medical care based solely on potential profitability, rather than any shred of humanitarian concern. A slave woman who proved fertile was treated as valuable breeding stock. She might receive better food, warmer shelter, and a temporary reduction in heavy labor, not out of compassion, but from pure economic calculation. Viking masters, with the clinical detachment of livestock farmers, tracked the fertility cycles of their female thralls. Pregnancy was not a private family matter but an economic event, meticulously recorded in the same ledgers that tracked the birth of calves and the yield of barley. Masters calculated the economic value of each pregnancy, making decisions about nutrition, workload, and medical care based solely on potential profitability rather than any shred of humanitarian concern. A slave woman who proved fertile was treated as valuable breeding stock. She might receive better food, warmer shelter, and a temporary reduction in heavy labor, not out of compassion, but from pure economic calculation. While very young children might remain with their mothers for nursing, they were often separated at a young age to prevent the development of strong emotional attachments that could complicate their utility as property. Brothers and sisters were deliberately scattered to different masters or different parts of a large estate, eliminating potential alliances and sources of mutual support or resistance. These children were raised in specialized settings where they were groomed for their future roles. Boys would be trained as laborers, field hands, or even warriors in their master's retinue, their loyalty enforced through a lifetime of conditioning. Girls were groomed for domestic service or sexual slavery, taught from their earliest memories that their bodies and their lives were not their own. The deliberate weakening of family bonds was a cornerstone of control. A mother who was emotionally detached from her children was less likely to risk escape or rebellion for their sake. A child who never knew the comfort of a stable family was more likely to see their master's hall as the only world that existed. The economics of this were ruthlessly efficient. A slave woman who could produce multiple healthy children during her fertile years represented a significant and compounding return on investment. Masters calculated the lifetime value of each female slave, not just on her labor capacity, but on her reproductive potential. A single purchase could yield decades of labor from the mother and then from her offspring, creating a multi-generational stream of wealth and service. This cold calculus transformed the most fundamental human relationship, that between mother and child, into a managed business operation, draining it of its humanity and repurposing it as fuel for the Viking economic engine. The reach of this brutal commerce was not confined to the Scandinavian world. It was a vast, international enterprise that connected the frozen north to the bustling markets of the east and south. Norse merchants operated a sophisticated network that stretched from the river routes of Russia down to the Black Sea and the Caspian, and from the Irish Sea to the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. In these distant markets, they adapted their human merchandise to local preferences with the savvy of modern global traders. Women captured in the British Isles and Western Europe, with their fair skin and light hair, were exotic luxuries in the Islamic markets of Baghdad and Constantinople, where they commanded premium prices as concubines and household servants. The 10th century Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, witnessing Viking traders on the Volga River, noted with meticulous detail their practices and the high value placed on these Russia women. Different regions developed specializations based on their captive populations. Irish women were frequently praised in sources for their beauty. Slavic captives, from whom the very word slave is derived, were valued for their hardiness and agricultural skills. Anglo-Saxon women were sought after for their reputed domestic competence and, in rare cases, literacy. The Viking slaver was, in essence, a market-driven predator, tailoring his raids to meet consumer demand hundreds of miles away. The 10th century Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, witnessing Viking traders on the Volga River, noted with meticulous detail their practices and the high value placed on these Russia women. Different regions developed specializations based on their captive populations. Irish women were frequently praised in sources for their beauty. Slavic captives, from whom the very word slave is derived, were valued for their hardiness and agricultural skills. Anglo-Saxon women were sought after for their reputed domestic competence and, in rare cases, literacy. The Viking slaver was, in essence, a market-driven predator, tailoring his raids to meet consumer demand hundreds of miles away. These classifications, akin to modern commodity grades, determined not only their final sale price, but also their treatment during the long and arduous journey to market. High-value captives might be transported with slightly more care to preserve their condition, while common laborers were moved with brutal efficiency. Market intelligence was crucial for profitability. Viking traders became students of foreign cultures, learning what types of women were most desired in different regions. This intelligence gathering informed their raiding strategies, making slave trading a more targeted and profitable enterprise than random pillaging. They weren't just taking people. They were harvesting specific products for a global marketplace. This international dimension reveals the Vikings not as mere brutes, but as canny, ruthless businessmen who understood and exploited the economic realities of their time, building a complex, transcontinental industry on the bedrock of human suffering. The physical tools of this trade, the restraint systems, were themselves products of sophisticated engineering and specialized craftsmanship. The iron shackles and chains found from Dublin to the Volga were not improvised. They were manufactured goods, designed specifically for the secure transport of human beings. Different designs served different purposes. Heavy, spiked collars were for the rebellious on the march. Lighter padded cuffs might be used for high-value captives on display at market. There were transport shackles that linked individuals together in a coffle, and there were permanent bondage systems for slaves working in mines or on remote farms. The manufacturing of these restraints became a specialized industry in its own right. Blacksmiths developed expertise in creating shackles that were secure enough to prevent escape, but, for the valuable cargo, not so damaging as to cause injuries that would reduce market value. The quality of the ironwork varied according to the intended use and the value of the captive, a chilling reflection of the commodification process. Innovation was constant. Over time, Viking slavers and the smiths who served them continuously improved their methods, developing new types of locks, more durable chain links, and more effective ways to control large groups of people. This standardization meant that a woman shackled in Northumbria could be transported all the way to the markets of Bulgar on the Volga without ever changing her bonds, a seamless and horrifying journey through a world that had standardized the machinery of her captivity. The expertise required to maintain this system, adjusting shackles for different body types, repairing damaged chains, modifying restraints for special circumstances, was a specialized knowledge passed down through generations of slavers, a dark technical tradition that served the most profitable enterprise of the Viking Age. The final, and perhaps most insidious, stage of enslavement was the psychological conditioning designed to manufacture compliance. This was not left to chance. It was a methodical process of indoctrination that began the moment a woman was captured and continued throughout her life. Newly captured women were often assigned to veteran slaves, who served as unwilling mentors in this brutal system. These older thralls, themselves broken by years of servitude, taught the newcomers the unwritten rules of survival, which masters were particularly cruel, how to perform tasks with maximum efficiency to minimize punishment, when silence was preferable to speech, and how to interpret the subtle shifts in a master's mood. This informal education system, born of shared suffering, helped some women survive, but it also tragically institutionalized the acceptance of bondage. The veterans became accomplices in their own continued oppression, passing on the hard-learned lessons of submission to the next generation of captives, ensuring the system's stability. The linguistic isolation imposed was another powerful tool. Women were taught a handful of basic Norse phrases necessary for understanding commands and begging for necessities, but they were often forbidden from speaking their native languages openly. This policy deliberately eroded their connection to their past and to each other, cutting them off from a primary source of psychological comfort and cultural identity. To speak your mother tongue was to remember who you were, and the system was intent on making you forget. Within the slave population itself, the masters carefully cultivated a hierarchy of misery. Small, seemingly insignificant privileges, a slightly better cut of meat, a warmer blanket, a less arduous chore, were awarded to the most compliant and servile slaves. This created a toxic environment of competition and resentment among the thralls, effectively preventing them from uniting against their common oppressor. Women found themselves fighting each other for these minor advantages, their energy diverted from potential resistance or escape plots. This strategy of divide and conquer ensured that the master remained the sole arbiter of a slave's comfort, however minimal, fostering a twisted sense of loyalty to the very person who enslaved them. The psychological techniques employed were sophisticated and devastatingly effective, resembling what modern psychologists would identify as brainwashing. Masters used a combination of isolation, forced dependency, and intermittent reinforcement, alternating random acts of cruelty with unexpected, unearned kindness, to create a state of profound psychological disorientation. The goal was to break down the individual's identity and will, and then rebuild her as a compliant subject, whose entire existence was oriented around anticipating and serving her master's needs. The most successful slaves, from the master's perspective, were those who developed a state of hypervigilance, learning to read their owner's slightest gesture or tone and to act upon it instantly. This was the ultimate form of psychological domination. The slave became a mere extension of the master's will, her own desires, preferences, and internal life systematically eliminated. She was not just owned, she was psychologically reconfigured. This entire brutal enterprise was not conducted in a moral vacuum. It was justified and glorified by a powerful cultural and religious narrative. Viking poets, skalds, and storytellers did not shy away from the reality of slavery. They celebrated it. They crafted sagas and poems that portrayed the capture of human plunder as divinely sanctioned. The gods themselves, particularly Odin, the lord of warriors and kings, were seen as rewarding, brave, and successful fighters with wealth, fame, and human chattel. A beautiful, high-born captive was not just a commodity. She was a gift from the gods, a tangible symbol of divine favor. In the epic poems, heroes were lauded for their exploits in raiding foreign lands and returning with ships laden with silver and thralls. The Heimskringla, a collection of sagas about Norse kings, is replete with references to kings taking captives and distributing them as rewards. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were potent propaganda, designed to legitimize and glorify systematic brutality, weaving it into the very fabric of what it meant to be a successful and honorable Norseman. Religious ceremonies often incorporated the display of captive women as living proof of a chieftain's power and the god's approval. They were forced to participate in rituals that celebrated their own enslavement, paraded as trophies during sacrifices and feasts. To be a Viking of status was to own thralls. To own many thralls, particularly exotic and beautiful ones, was to display your worth, your reach, and your standing in the eyes of both men and gods. From childhood, Norse youths were immersed in these cultural narratives, hearing stories that normalized human trafficking as a legitimate, even heroic, activity. The system was perpetuated not just by chains and whips, but by songs, stories, and religious belief, making it seem as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. The meticulous nature of the Vikings extended to their record-keeping, leaving behind a chilling paper trail of their commerce. Viking merchants and stewards maintained detailed inventories of their slave populations, tracking ages, skills, health status, and fluctuating market values. These records, some of which have survived in fragmentary form or are referenced in later texts, were essential business tools. They helped merchants make informed purchasing decisions at market and allowed chieftains to plan future raiding expeditions to capture specific types of captives for which there was high demand. Legal documents from the period provide further evidence of the systematic nature of Viking slavery. Contracts for slave purchases, wills that carefully bequeathed human property to heirs, and court records detailing disputes over ownership all demonstrate that human trafficking was thoroughly integrated into the Norse legal and economic systems. What is perhaps most striking about these written records is the complete absence of any moral questioning. The brutality is not hidden, apologized for, or euphemized. It is recorded with the same dispassionate clarity as any other business transaction. The ledgers list human beings alongside barrels of fish and bundles of furs. The wills treat a skilled blacksmith thrall as being of similar value to a good sword. This complete normalization, this bureaucratic acceptance of human beings as inventory, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire system. It reveals a civilization that had not only built its prosperity on organized cruelty, but had also developed the administrative tools to manage that cruelty with flawless, soulless efficiency. The Vikings were not ashamed of their human trafficking. Their own records show they were proud of their prowess, their reach, and their commercial acumen. The suffering of countless women was, in their ledgers, just another column of numbers, a testament to a machine that consumed souls and excreted silver. The legacy of the Viking slave machine is not confined to dusty ledgers and ancient sagas. It is etched into the very DNA of modern populations and has left deep, unhealed scars on the cultural landscape of Europe. The scale of this forced migration was so vast that its genetic signature remains detectable a millennium later. Modern population genetic studies, analyzing the mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, reveal a startling pattern across the North Atlantic. In places like Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of coastal Norway, a significant portion of the founding female population has genetic origins in the British Isles, particularly Ireland and Scotland. The male lineage, by contrast, is overwhelmingly Scandinavian. This provides powerful, silent testimony to the fate of countless Celtic and Anglo-Saxon women. They did not arrive as settlers' wives, but as captives. Their genetic legacy, a permanent, biological record of the raid that tore them from their homes. They are the anonymous grandmothers of nations, their individual stories lost, but their collective presence, an undeniable fact of history, written in the language of genetics. Their suffering, their forced journeys, and their subjugation are woven into the biological fabric of the modern world, a haunting echo of the human cost of the Viking Age. The impact on the raided communities was catastrophic and long-lasting. The systematic removal of young women created a demographic catastrophe that crippled societies for generations. A village that loses its daughters loses its future. The most direct impact was a dramatic decline in birth rates, creating a missing generation that destabilized social and economic structures. The traditional work of women textile production, food processing, childcare, and the maintenance of oral traditions and local healing knowledge was severely disrupted, leading to economic decline and cultural impoverishment. Languages may have lost speakers. Specific crafts and local customs could have vanished entirely when the women who were their primary practitioners were carried away. The psychological trauma inflicted on these communities was immeasurable. The constant, looming threat of a raid created a culture of pervasive fear and hypervigilance along the coastlines of Europe. The stories of what happened to the women, the examinations, the marches, the ships, the markets, became powerful folktales of horror, passed down to warn subsequent generations. This trauma altered behavior, influencing settlement patterns, with communities moving inland to less fertile but more defensible ground, and shaping political responses as local rulers found themselves forced to pay the Danegeld, a protection ransom, to stave off the terrifying possibility of seeing their own women led away in chains. The Viking slave trade was not just an attack on individuals, it was an assault on the very reproductive and cultural core of entire societies, an attack from which some regions took centuries to recover. For the enslaved women themselves, the process of transformation was systematic, comprehensive, and designed to be irreversible. It was a campaign of identity destruction that operated on every level: physical, psychological, cultural, and spiritual. It began with the forced name change, severing the most basic linguistic tie to their past. It continued with the stripping away of their native dress and the shearing of their hair, removing the external markers of their culture and status. The prohibition against speaking their mother tongue, except in furtive, stolen moments, attacked their ability to think and dream in the language of their childhood, further isolating them in their new reality. The forced religious conversion was the ultimate conquest, an assault on their soul, demanding they renounce the God of their fathers and mothers and embrace the pantheon of their captors. They were made to wear the hammer of Thor, to eat sacred pagan foods, and to participate in rituals that celebrated the destruction of their own world. Every aspect of their daily lives was engineered to reinforce their new status as thrall. Even for the tiny minority who might eventually gain a measure of limited freedom or a position of responsibility within a household, the cost was the complete abandonment of any hope of returning to their former lives. They were irrevocably changed, their original identities systematically scrubbed away and overwritten with a new, subservient one. They were, for all intents and purposes, religious and cultural orphans, their old selves murdered long before their bodies ceased to function. The operation of the slave trade followed predictable and profitable seasonal patterns, reflecting its deep integration into the Viking economic cycle. The raids were primarily launched in the spring and summer, timed with strategic precision. These were the months when the seas were navigable, but also when coastal communities were at their most vulnerable. Their people dispersed in fields for the crucial planting and harvest seasons, away from the relative safety of fortified towns. The long, light nights of the northern summer allowed for extended travel and surprise attacks. The captured human cargo would then be processed and transported throughout the late summer and autumn to be sold in the major winter trading centers like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin. These winter markets were social and economic hubs where chieftains and merchants gathered not only to trade but to settle disputes, form alliances, and plan the next year's expeditions. It was here that the demand for slaves was highest, as buyers sought labor for the coming year's farming, mining, and household needs. The Vikings, ever practical, had turned human trafficking into a seasonal industry, its rhythms dictated by weather, agriculture, and the calendar of commerce. In the end, the Viking slave machine did not grind to a halt because of a moral awakening or a sudden pang of collective conscience. Its decline was a slow process, driven by broader economic and political changes. As Scandinavia itself began to coalesce into centralized kingdoms like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the old model of independent chieftains leading private raiding parties became less viable. Kings sought to control violence and establish stable, taxable economies. The rise of powerful, organized states in former target areas like Anglo-Saxon England and Francia made raiding increasingly costly and difficult. Simultaneously, the conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity over the 10th and 11th centuries introduced a new moral framework that, while slow to change entrenched practices, gradually made the open trade and co-religionists more problematic. But perhaps most importantly, other forms of economic exploitation simply became more profitable and sustainable than the high-risk business of long-distance slaving. The establishment of permanent trade routes for fish, timber, and wool, and the integration of Scandinavia into the European feudal economy offered new paths to wealth that did not require the logistical nightmare and immense human cost of the slave trade. The machine stopped not because it was deemed evil, but because it was, in the end, made obsolete by the very forces of history and economic progress it had helped to set in motion. The long ships eventually rotted, the slave markets crumbled to dust, and the ledgers were forgotten. But the echoes of the suffering they recorded have never fully faded. The true, enduring legacy of the Viking slave trade is not found in the sagas of kings or the treasures of hoards, but in the silent, collective memory of suffering and the sobering historical lesson it imparts. The machine has long since stopped running. The longships have decayed into dust, their dragon-proud silhouettes a ghostly memory. The bustling, brutal slave markets of Dublin and Hedeby are now archaeological sites, their auction blocks buried beneath centuries of soil and progress. The detailed ledgers, filled with the prices and particulars of human beings, have either been lost to time or sit in museum cases, their dry entries belying the ocean of agony they represent. The physical apparatus of this vast enterprise is gone, but the echoes remain. They resonate in the genetic markers carried by millions of descendants across the North Atlantic, a biological whisper of those stolen women. They linger in the place names and folklore of ravaged coastlines, in the deep-seated cultural memories of nations that learn to fear the sight of a sail on the horizon. The testimony endures in the scarred bones pulled from the earth and the cold, utilitarian iron of the shackles that bound them. This evidence forms an unassailable truth that challenges the romanticized image of the Viking as a mere explorer or a noble savage. It forces us to confront the full, uncomfortable complexity of history. The women whose lives were consumed by this system remain, for the most part, nameless. Their individual stories, their laughter, their loves, their unique hopes and fears were the first casualties of their capture. They were systematically erased, their identities dissolved into the generic categories of the ledger. Irish woman, young, fair, good teeth. They became statistics in the economic calculations of their captors. But they were not statistics. They were not merchandise. They were human beings, each with a capacity for love, creativity, joy, and faith that was systematically crushed to feed an empire built on organized cruelty. Their lives mattered. Their pain was real, a searing, personal reality for each and every one of them, from the moment they were torn from their families to their last, lonely breath in a foreign land. Their voices were silenced by their captors, but they still cry out to us not in words, but in the stark, silent language of the archaeological record, in the fragmented testimony of chroniclers who witnessed the aftermath, and in the undeniable genetic legacy they left behind. To tell their story, even through the cold records of their oppressors, is to perform an act of remembrance. It is to defiantly reaffirm the humanity that the Viking machine tried so desperately to destroy. This history demands a nuanced remembrance. It is not a call to dismiss the very real achievements of Norse culture, their artistry, their shipbuilding, their exploratory spirit. Rather, it is a demand that we remember the entire picture, not just the glittering surface. The magnificent halls, the far-flung trade networks, the very foundation of some Scandinavian kingdoms, were paid for with a currency of human suffering. The Vikings proved, with terrifying efficiency, that civilization and brutality are not mutually exclusive. They demonstrated that a society can make staggering cultural and technological advances while being morally bankrupt in its treatment of those it deems other. They showed that bureaucracy can be a handmaiden to horror, that meticulous record-keeping can organize misery, and that an entire civilization can prosper through the methodical destruction of human dignity. This is perhaps the most chilling lesson of all, that the machinery of oppression can be refined, systemized, and even celebrated, disguised as economic progress and divine will. The wives and daughters of the defeated warriors deserved a different fate. They deserved to live out their lives in the homes they built. They deserved to love and be loved by the families they chose. They deserved to grow old, to be surrounded by children who shared their names and grandchildren who would carry their stories forward into the future. These most basic human aspirations were denied them. Instead, they were fed alive into a machine that consumed human souls and excreted silver coins. It ground down their past, present, and future into a commodity. Their legacy is not found in the sagas that glorify their captors, but in the quiet, solemn evidence of their suffering and in the genetic threads of their existence, woven unwittingly into the tapestry of nations that arose long after they were gone. They were human beings. They mattered. And in remembering their suffering, we do more than just recount a dark chapter of history. We honor the indomitable spark of humanity that their captors could never fully extinguish. We acknowledge that history is not just the story of the victorious, the powerful, and the celebrated. It is also the story of the crushed, the silenced, and the forgotten. Their story is a permanent testament to the human cost of conquest, a stark reminder that behind every era of great expansion and cultural achievement, there are often countless, nameless individuals who paid the ultimate price. The Viking Age ends, but the echo of their experience remains, a somber and essential note in the long, complex song of human history. It asks of us not to judge the past by our standards, but to understand it in its full, often terrifying, complexity. And in that understanding, we find a warning about the perpetual capacity for human systems to dehumanize, and a corresponding duty to remember the victims, to give their silent suffering a voice, and to ensure that such machines of misery are never again allowed to operate with such ruthless, efficient, and documented impunity. The terror inflicted by the Viking slave machine was not confined to the immediate victims. It was a psychological weapon of mass disruption, its shockwaves designed to cripple the morale and will of entire regions for generations. The Vikings mastered the art of psychological warfare, understanding that the fear of enslavement could be more powerful than the act itself. This dread began as a whisper on the wind, carried by the rare escapee or the tales of travelers, long before a longship ever breached the horizon. By the late 8th century, the coastal communities of Europe were living in a state of anticipatory trauma. The sight of an unfamiliar sail was no longer just a curiosity, it was a potential death sentence for a community's future. Monks in their scriptoria along the Irish Sea, fishermen on the shores of Northumbria, farmers in the Frankish river valleys, all had heard the stories. They knew the fate that awaited their women was not a simple death in battle, but a protracted, systematic erasure in the holds of ships and on the auction blocks of distant, pagan lands. This foreknowledge created a culture of paralyzing hypervigilance. This cultivated terror was then leveraged into a tool of economic and political extortion. The infamous Danegeld, the vast silver tributes paid by Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kings, was not merely a payment to spare cities from burning. Its unspoken primary function was often to purchase immunity from the slave raid. Kings and local rulers paid astronomical sums, not just to save stone and timber, but to prevent the catastrophic, irreparable loss of their people, specifically their women and children. The Vikings became master extortionists, aware that the threat of mass abduction could empty treasuries more efficiently than any siege. They would sometimes stage deliberate, terrifying tableaus, rounding up captured women on a beach within sight of a town's walls, before negotiations even began, making the stakes horrifically clear. The unpredictability was a key tactic. Sometimes, paying the ransom worked. Other times, the Vikings would take the silver and the people, an act of supreme treachery that deepened the pervasive sense of helplessness and made communities doubt any path to safety. This strategic inconsistency meant no treaty, no payment, and no wall could ever offer complete security. The psychological assault was meticulously personalized during the raids to maximize long-term communal trauma. Beyond the initial separation, Viking raiders would often force impossible choices upon the vanquished, designed to shatter the moral and social fabric of a community. A husband might be made to choose which of his daughters would be taken. A village elder could be bound and forced to watch as his granddaughter was examined and valued. A defeated thegn or minor lord would be paraded past the column of shackled women, recognizing the faces of his former subjects. His complete powerlessness, now a public spectacle. This was not random cruelty, it was a calculated demonstration. The message was, your authority, your social bonds, your God, they are illusions. We have the power to force you to betray everything you hold sacred. Your resistance has brought this upon them. By making community leaders complicit in the selection or witnesses to the degradation, the Vikings broke the spirit of leadership itself. The trauma was engineered to be generational, ensuring that even those who survived would be too guilt-ridden, too humiliated, and too terrified to organize effective resistance in the future. The terror was then weaponized through its survivors. Women and children deemed too old, too young, or too infirm for the slave march were sometimes deliberately left behind. This was not an act of mercy, but a calculated tactic of psychological propagation. These broken witnesses, a grandmother who saw her grandchildren dragged away, a wounded boy who watched his sisters being chained, became living vectors of terror. They staggered to neighboring settlements or back to their shattered homes, carrying with them not just grief, but detailed, first-hand testimony of the Viking system's cold efficiency. They could describe the scribes with their ledgers, the specific factory-made shackles, the dispassionate professionalism of the slavers. This credible, granular detail made the horror tangible and far more potent than any rumor. Similarly, the very rare individual who escaped from a slave convoy or a distant market became a ghost returned, their presence a constant, chilling reminder of the fate that had befallen others. Their stories, told and retold, would seep into the folklore and chronicles of the region, cementing the Viking reputation and expanding their psychological footprint far beyond their actual military reach. The chronicler Ethelweird, writing in the late 10th century, encapsulated this pervasive dread, describing the Vikings not just as warriors, but as a ferocious pestilence, a sickness of fear that infected the land. This psychological warfare continued seamlessly into the state of bondage itself. The systematic isolation of captives splitting up speakers of the same language, tearing mothers from children served a dual purpose. While it prevented organized resistance, its more insidious function was to create a state of profound existential loneliness. A woman alone, with no one to share her grief in her native tongue, no familiar face to offer a glance of solidarity, was psychologically naked before her captors. This isolation was the necessary precondition for the next stage: psychological reprogramming. It created a vacuum of identity and connection, into which the master could project a new reality. The goal was to make the thrall feel that her entire world, past, present, and future, had been annihilated, leaving only the immediate reality of her master's will as her sole point of reference. In this state of profound dislocation, the techniques of intermittent reinforcement and forced dependency could take root most effectively. The Viking slavers, in their ruthless pragmatism, had stumbled upon fundamental principles of breaking the human spirit. Their most devastating weapon was not the bearded axe, but the meticulously engineered despair that began as a rumor on a distant coast and culminated in the hollow eyes of a thrall who had lost all memory of home. For the Christian women ensnared in the Viking machine, the assault was not merely physical or psychological. It was a targeted war against the soul. The forced religious conversion imposed upon them was the final, and for many, the most devastating frontier of conquest. It represented an attempt to annihilate the last, most intimate sanctuary of their identity, their faith. This was not a gradual, persuasive missionary endeavor. It was a violent, theatrical, and systematic campaign of spiritual obliteration, designed to sever their connection to their God, their community of belief, and their hope for eternal salvation. To be cut off from Christ in a world where faith was the bedrock of reality was a form of spiritual death, often perceived as more terrifying than physical demise. The Vikings, whether pagan or newly converted themselves, understood the profound power of this lever and used it with brutal precision. The conversion ceremonies were orchestrated spectacles of humiliation and sacrilege, carefully staged to maximize psychological violation. A captured Christian woman, perhaps once a devout daughter of the church, would be dragged before a Viking priest, a Godi, or her master himself in his hall, surrounded by leering warriors. Sacred objects taken from plundered monasteries, a crucifix, a chalice, a Bible, might be present as props. She would be forced to publicly renounce her faith, to spit upon the cross, to trample on holy relics, and to recite pagan oaths to Odin, Thor, or Freya in a language she did not understand. The 13th century saga of Olaf Tryggvason, though written later, captures the essence of such coerced conversions, describing pagans forcing baptized men to make sacrifices or face torture and death. For a woman raised to venerate these symbols, the act was a profound inner atrocity. It was a ritual designed to make her an accomplice in her own spiritual damnation, creating a trauma that fused religious terror with personal guilt. Refusal was not an option that led to martyrdom's quick release. It often led to prolonged creative torture, being suspended over slow fires, suffering bone-breaking beatings, or witnessing the torture of others until the will broke and the hated words were spoken. The goal was not just verbal assent, but a visible, performative surrender that would crush her spirit and serve as a warning to others. This spiritual conquest served multiple, coldly pragmatic purposes for the captor. First, it was a powerful tool of isolation. A woman who had been forced to renounce Christianity was cut off from a primary potential source of rescue and solidarity. In a world where religious identity was paramount, Christian communities were far less likely to aid or shelter a known apostate, even one who had been coerced. She became a religious orphan, belonging neither to her old world nor fully to the new. Second, it eliminated a critical wellspring of internal resistance and comfort. The prayers, rituals, and beliefs of her faith had been a source of strength, a framework for understanding suffering, and a promise of ultimate justice. By systematically desecrating these, her captors destroyed a key psychological defense mechanism, leaving her more vulnerable to despair and dependency. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the master's absolute, totalizing power. If he could command not only her body and labor but also her soul, forcing her to blaspheme against her God, then his dominion was complete. It was the ultimate assertion of ownership. The erasure of her Christian identity was then reinforced in the minute details of daily life, a constant drip feed of spiritual corrosion. She was forced to wear the symbol of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, around her neck instead of her cross. She was made to eat horse meat, a staple in Norse diet but explicitly forbidden by the church as it was associated with pagan sacrifice. She was compelled to participate in seasonal pagan festivals like Dísablót or Yule, celebrations that often involved toasts to the Norse gods and rites that honored the very forces that had destroyed her homeland. Every meal, every piece of jewelry, every seasonal celebration became a reminder of her spiritual captivity. Even private devotion became a dangerous act. Masters and their household spies were adept at detecting clandestine faith. The discovery of a secreted cross, a fragment of a psalm scratched on wood, or the caught murmur of a paternoster could lead to severe, public punishment. Some sources, like the hagiography of Street, Elfhea, hint at Vikings specifically targeting religious devotion for mockery and violence. The suspicion of continued Christian belief alone could lead to torture designed to extract a confession of backsliding. This relentless pressure created an internal prison far more secure than any shackle. A woman lived in fear not only of external punishment but of her own thoughts, her own silent prayers, which she began to see as threats to her fragile survival. For the devout, this posed an unbearable theological and existential crisis. Had their God abandoned them? Was their forced apostasy an unforgivable sin that condemned them to hell? Or was their suffering a test of faith, a hidden martyrdom? Some may have found ways to maintain a secret, internal faith, clinging to remembered psalms in the darkness of the hold. Others, broken by the systematic assault, may have eventually succumbed, their old beliefs fading under the weight of a brutal new reality where the Norse gods seemed to hold all the power. This internal conflict, the struggle for a soul, was the most intimate battlefield of the Viking slave trade. The system sought to prove that even the most deeply held convictions could be unmade, that a human being could be spiritually hollowed out and remade as a pagan chattel. In this, they revealed the darkest ambition of their machine: to not just own the body, but to conquer and reshape the very essence of the person, leaving a hollow vessel perfectly suited to its purpose of labor, breeding, and display. The echo of this spiritual violence is perhaps the quietest, yet deepest, scar left by the trade, a testament to a form of cruelty that sought to reach beyond the physical world and into the realm of eternity. Beyond the fields, the kitchens, and the master's bed, the enslaved Viking woman faced a uniquely clinical horror. Her body was managed as a reproductive asset. The Viking slave system did not merely exploit labor. It harvested and manufactured human life with the dispassionate efficiency of a livestock breeder. For a female thrall, proven fertility was a primary determinant of her long-term value, and her womb was treated as a means of production, a factory for generating new units of property. This transformed the most intimate and profound human experience, pregnancy and motherhood, into a cold, monitored economic process. Masters or their stewards maintained detailed records, tracking menstrual cycles, conceptions, gestation periods, and birth outcomes. This was not gynecology, it was inventory management. The health of a pregnant thrall was protected not from compassion, but from financial calculation. A pregnant woman represented a significant capital investment in future assets. She might receive marginally better food, a reduction in heavy labor, and basic care during childbirth, all calibrated to maximize the likelihood of producing a healthy, surviving infant. The child, from its first breath, was not her own. Under Norse law, articulated in codes like the Gragas, the condition of thrallhood, was matrilineal. A child born to an enslaved mother was a born thrall, the absolute property of her master, regardless of the father's status. Thus, every pregnancy represented a dividend on the master's initial investment, a self-replicating increase to his human capital. The management of these slave-born children was a cornerstone of the system's long-term sustainability, and it was engineered to sever the very bonds it exploited. While infants might remain with their mothers for nursing, separation was typically enforced at a young age. This was a deliberate policy to prevent the development of strong emotional attachments that could complicate the child's utility as obedient property, or, worse, give the mother a compelling reason to resist or escape. Siblings were deliberately scattered, sold to different masters, sent to different parts of a large estate, or assigned to different types of labor. This practice of familial dispersal eliminated natural alliances, stifled the formation of a shared slave identity, and crushed the potential for collective resistance rooted in kinship. The children were then raised in an environment designed to mold them for their predetermined roles. Boys were trained as field hands, herdsmen, or even housecarls, their loyalty forged through a lifetime of conditioning, and their identity rooted solely in service to their owner. Girls were groomed from childhood for domestic servitude or, as they matured, to follow their mothers into sexual and reproductive servitude. They were taught that their bodies were not their own, that their purpose was defined by their master's needs. The system sought to create a class of people for whom freedom was an alien concept, whose entire worldview was bounded by the walls of their bondage. This systematic severing of the mother-child bond was a psychological masterstroke of control. It attacked the most powerful instinct, transforming a potential source of strength and rebellion into a source of perpetual, agonizing grief. A mother who was allowed to keep and love her child might find in that love a powerful reason to fight, to hope, or to escape. But a mother whose child was taken, who might catch only fleeting glimpses of her son laboring in a distant field or her daughter serving in the main hall, was psychologically crippled. Her love became a source of unbearable pain and powerlessness. Furthermore, it made her dependent on the master's whim for any contact with her child, twisting the natural bond into another lever of control. He could dangle the possibility of a visit as a reward for compliance, or threaten permanent separation as punishment. The economics of this were as ruthless as they were effective. A fertile female slave was a gift that kept on giving. Her initial purchase price could yield not only decades of her own labor but also the lifetime labor of her children, and potentially their children. Masters calculated the lifetime value of a female thrall with this compound interest in mind. A robust, fertile woman in her late teens could represent generations of bound labor, making her one of the most profitable investments available in the Viking world. The stark reality of this breeding economy is reflected in the chilling price lists recorded by contemporary observers, particularly Arab merchants like Ibn Fadlan and Ibn Rusta, who traded with the Rus Vikings on the Volga. Their accounts provide a window into a market where human beings were graded and priced with precision. The highest prices were commanded by young, beautiful virgins, unblemished luxury goods for the wealthy. Experienced mothers, while costing less, were explicitly valued for their proven fertility. Older women, past childbearing age, were often worth little more than common tools or aged livestock. These price differentials are a stark ledger of reproductive economics. They show that the market understood and monetized a woman's biological capacity with brutal clarity. The international dimension amplified this. In the markets of the Islamic world, where the Vikings sold many captives, fair-skinned women from the north were exotic luxuries. A fertile Celtic or Slavic woman, capable of producing children who would themselves be exotic servants or concubines, represented a premium, long-term investment for a wealthy buyer in Baghdad or Cordoba. Thus, a woman's fate, the type of labor she would perform, the level of comfort or brutality she would endure, was often decided by a cold assessment of her reproductive potential, assessed first on a bloodied European beach and finalized on a bustling Eastern auction block. In the Viking slave machine, love was a liability, motherhood was a manufacturing process, and children were the most durable, self-replicating form of currency.